Thank you everyone again for joining the webinar today and bearing with us with some technical issues. Today's webinar, 2020 Census, Learn About What's at Stake for Pennsylvania, will be hosted by Erin, the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Voice and Keystone Counts. Thank you, Erin, so much for presenting today, and I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you everyone for jumping on the call today. We appreciate people's interest in starting to learn more about the 2020 census. As Colleen said, I'm the Executive Director of Pennsylvania Voice, and we are a statewide organization that has been focused on building long-term engagement and involvement of the new American majority communities of color, youth, and single women across Pennsylvania since 2010. And we're a partnership-based organization. And one of the things that the partnership has started to recognize is the impact of a fair and accurate census for Pennsylvania, and recognizing that this is an issue that impacts all of us across the state, and that we wanted to start engaging on it now, as well as expanding the number of organizations that we're working with across Pennsylvania to ensure a fair and accurate census. What I want to cover today is an opportunity to talk about what's at stake for Pennsylvania with the 2020 census, to talk about some of the challenges that are facing the 2020 census, and then specifically talk about where and how organizations can get involved. The census and doing a count of every single person in the country is a core piece of our civic engagement work, and a core piece of what we ask of our of people who live in the United States. Every 10 years, the Census Bureau is tasked with counting every single person in the country. As you can imagine, that is a monumental task, to be able to count every single person. And the reason why that is so critical is that the census data plays such an important role in the work that we do, in the way that we interact with understanding who the Commonwealth is, who lives here, and what that means for us to be building a vibrant and strong community in Pennsylvania. So what's really at stake for Pennsylvania? First, every 10 years, the Census Bureau counts every single person in the state, and that data is then used to help determine our representation in Congress. Right now, we have 18 members of Congress. We are projected, though, going into the 2020 census, to actually lose a seat. Because our population is not growing at the same rate as other states, we are projected to lose 1 congressional seat. In some projections, we could actually lose up to 2 if we don't do a good count of every single person who lives in Pennsylvania. The second thing about what's at stake for Pennsylvania is how census data is used in so many different ways to plan and understand our communities, what the needs are, and what they look towards. So this is everything from thinking about where housing needs to be developed, what are the needs in the community to have more housing needs. This type of data is used in helping to determine how and where roads and hospitals are being built. It's how philanthropy uses the data to understand what the community needs and how the philanthropy community can help address those needs in these communities. And then obviously resources. The federal government depends on census data both directly and through different ways to help determine federal funding and how it is directed into all the different states. And this is something that is really driven home if you look at this slide that talks about specifically the 16 largest federally assisted programs that distribute funds based on the decennial census generated in FY 2015 $26.7 billion to support vital programs in Pennsylvania. This is everything that ranges from medical assistance programs like Medicaid and SNAP to Section 8 housing and all the other critical programs that are here in Pennsylvania that we use to build and support the communities that we need. But the reason why we are getting involved now is that, as you can imagine, being able to count every single person in the country is a really challenging task for the Census Bureau. And historically, there have always been challenges with some groups, what we define as hard-to-count communities, that are more likely to be missed than others. This includes kids, specifically kids under 5, the immigrant population, people of color, low-income households, and rural households all present challenges for counting accurately and fairly. And as we look at the 2020 census and some of the new challenges that we're seeing in the planning and preparation for the census, as well as some of the changes that the Census Bureau is planning on implementing, we think there's going to be even more new obstacles for overcoming these challenges. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like across the state, there are 24 counties that have significant populations of the hard-to-count communities. What that means for us is that as we talked about with both reapportionment and our members of Congress, federal funding, the census data is really about counting every single person in Pennsylvania. And so looking at this, you'll identify that there are some counties that just because of their populations, that it's going to be hard to count and hard to have a fair and accurate census. But that's going to impact all of us in Pennsylvania. If we see an undercount in one area of the state, it impacts our representation, it impacts our economic and federal funding, and that's why we across the Commonwealth really need to understand what's at stake for Pennsylvania and why it's so important that nonprofit communities get involved now to help ensure that there's a fair and accurate census. So I want to talk a little bit about what's at risk for this current census. As I mentioned, hard-to-count communities has always been a challenge for the Census Bureau, and for a whole host of different reasons. But what we're seeing for the 2020 census is that we're at an even higher risk because of some of the things that are happening around the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau spends 9 to 10 years just doing the ramp-up of getting ready to count every single person during their bicentennial census. This means that every year after 2010, they were in preparation mode, doing testing and research and making sure that their systems are in place and they are getting ready. What we've seen is a consistent underfunding and shortfalls and uncertainty for the Census Bureau's budget, which has created kind of stops and fits in terms of their being able to prepare for an accurate census. Because of these funding shortfalls, the Census Bureau has had to cancel critical tests that gives them the research and the data to make sure that they're in the best place possible to be able to prepare to count every single person in Pennsylvania and across the country. These shortfalls have also impacted some of the critical programs that the Census Bureau runs to ensure that they have the systems and they have the positions in place to help partner with nonprofits across the state to ensure that these hard-to-count communities understand the role of the census in their life, understand why it's important for them to fill it out, and actually move them to participate in the census. These funding shortfalls have meant that the Census Bureau has had to cut back on these key programs, specifically their partnership programs, as well as some of the mini grants that they provided in previous census. And we're concerned about what that means in terms of making sure that these hard-to-count communities, kids under 18, immigrants, people of color, rural households, and others are not going to be accurately counted. The other thing that we're concerned about that you guys might have read about is at a last minute, the Census Bureau and the Secretary of State of Commerce, who oversees the Census Bureau, submitted an untested citizenship question into the questionnaire that they're planning on doing for the 2020 census. This has created alarms both within the Census Bureau as well as former leaders and civil servants who worked at the Census Bureau under both administrations. It's been a bipartisan concern that this untested question being added to the Census Bureau questionnaire for the 2020 census could have an impact on communities not filling out the census. Every single question that the Census Bureau has been planning on adding to the 2020 census has gone through research and testing to make sure that they're getting the right answers and that people are responding to the questions in the way that the questions are being asked. This untested citizenship question could mean that we could see communities, both citizens and non-citizens, native-born and immigrants, unsure about why this question is being asked of them and choosing not to fill out the census. This could mean that we see large amounts of communities not being counted in the 2020 census. There's efforts underway to both challenge this last-minute question, both through a legislative effort, but then also through legal efforts too. You might have heard that Pennsylvania's Attorney General joined other Attorney Generals across the state, really calling into question and that this untested citizenship question has not gone through the rigorous expectations that we would expect any question to be added onto the 2020 census. The other things that are at risk with the 2020 census is that the Census Bureau, for the first time ever, will be launching a first high-tech census. This is an exciting opportunity because it allows them to do cost savings. But as we all know and have seen from previous efforts to move from paper to online, that you have to put in a lot of time and energy into building the right infrastructure, allowing people to ensure that the infrastructure is available so that people can go online to fill out the census online versus on paper, which is what has been happening, which has been the standard in previous census. While we're excited that they're moving into the first high-tech census because of the cost savings, it also means that some of these shortfalls and uncertainties with their funding there's not been enough time and energy invested in making sure that their technical infrastructure is in place. The other thing we want to lift up is there has been a climate of fear and distrust that is growing in communities across the state. Many communities don't understand the role of the census, what it means to them, and why it's so important for them to be able to participate in the Census Bureau. And there's a lot of concern that with this untested citizenship question, as well as other climates of fear and distrust of the government, that individuals without the right focus might choose not to participate in the 2020 census. This could have a long-term impact for us here in Pennsylvania, in the Commonwealth, as well as across the country, if people are choosing not to participate in the 2020 census. It could impact our federal funding. It could impact our ability to really understand who are the people that live in the Commonwealth and what they need to do around it. And so we've worked to really start calling and wanting to start building an effort with nonprofits across the state to recognize that it is a critical piece for us for a fair and accurate census, and that every single person who lives in Pennsylvania needs to be counted, and that nonprofits as trusted messengers who both understand the role of the census in the work that you're doing to provide critical housing for the communities of Pennsylvania across the state, as well as understanding the role of the census in community planning, is that it's critical for us to really start thinking about what we can do to ensure a fair and accurate census. So the Keystone Counts Coalition was created by organizations across the state to start recognizing that we needed to do something now to start preparing for the 2020 census. And so what it's going to take is that there's a couple of critical pieces. First, we need to make sure as a community that the nonprofit community is starting to talk about why it's so critical for the 2020 census, what's at stake for the Commonwealth, and what are the things that are at risk. And we need to make sure that at both the state and federal level, our elected leaders and decision makers are understanding that they have a critical investment in ensuring that everyone is counted here. This means that we need to make sure at the federal level that the Census Bureau is getting the funding that they need in order to run an accurate census. And then here in Pennsylvania, we need to make sure that our elected leaders understand that we could see an undercount if we're not seeing effective work done to educate communities about the role of the census and why they should be filling it out. And at the state level, elected leaders should be thinking about what role they can be playing, whether it's helping to create funds to support nonprofits to do education and outreach, whether it's creating their own complete count committees so that they're helping to lift up what the census is and what it means. We need to make sure that we are helping them think about what role they can be playing in the census. The second is we need to see a coordinated effort of trusted messengers working across Pennsylvania to do education and field outreach into communities that can help take what is often an unknown bureaucratic thing of counting every single person and helping people realize what that actually means to a community, why participating in the census is so critical for us to be building vibrant communities in Pennsylvania. And we need to make sure that trusted messengers are out there doing that critical work. The third thing that needs to happen is we need to see coordination between nonprofits who are doing this work in key counties across the state, connecting to regional efforts and connecting to state-level efforts, both with the Census Bureau as well as with national efforts, who are all committed to seeing a fair and accurate census, knowing that even if work done by nonprofits in the Southeast, it matters if we're not learning from each other and connecting to other nonprofits in other parts of the state, because an undercount in any part of Pennsylvania will impact us all. And the last thing that we need to do is we need to see the in-state philanthropy community get engaged with understanding what the 2020 census is, what it means for them and the work that they're doing, as well as what it means for their grantees. And we want to make sure that the funder community is starting to do engagement and coordination. They're already starting to have these conversations, but it's so critical for us as nonprofit leaders and civic leaders across Pennsylvania to be talking about this important issue. And so we're really looking both to make sure that others across the state, other trusted messengers and nonprofits, are starting to have this conversation internally as well as externally with each other about what role the 2020 census plays in our life, why we're so concerned about it, and what ways can people get involved. But we also want to make sure that we're building a statewide coalition that is helping to make sure that we are all coordinating, sharing resources and knowledge with each other so that we're effectively making sure that everyone is getting counted in the 2020 census. And so we're looking for organizations who are interested in joining Keystone Counts and finding different ways that you can help be part of ensuring a fair and accurate census. But we're also really wanting to make sure that people are understanding what's at stake for Pennsylvania. So I wanted to be able to stop there to see who has questions and what are the resources that you're looking for in order for you to be able to figure out how to engage in the 2020 census.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erin. So I'm going to unmute the lines
The conference has been unmuted.
so that everybody has the opportunity to ask their question. You can also type your questions into the chat box feature if you'd like.
Well, I'm hoping it's people are feel like they've gotten their answers, their questions answered already. But we're happy to answer any questions around both why we're concerned about the 2020 census, what's been happening with it, but then also specifically what we think can be done to help address it.
Great. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to thank you, Erin, so much for presenting today. And we did record today's webinar, so the recording and the slides for the webinar will be sent out early next week. And we really appreciate you joining today's call. Thank you, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.